When Paul and his companions arrive in Jerusalem, they go to see Jesus' brother James and the other elders, and they report to them what God had been doing among the Gentiles. The elders praise God, but they inform Paul of a rumor going around that Paul denounces not only circumcision among Gentiles, but among Jews as well, telling them to throw out the law of Moses. And they let Paul know that there are 4 men among them who are waiting to finish participating in the Jewish purification rites, and they recommend that Paul accompany them and pay for their expenses so that the rumor that Paul is against the laws of Moses will be put to rest. And they add that they themselves have not forgotten the letter of encouragement they had previously sent to the Gentile believers, saying that they needed only to follow a small handful of laws intended for all of humanity, and not the special laws made specifically for the Jews. And Paul agreed to go with the 4 men, and he paid for their purification rites. A week later, some Jews from the province of Asia saw Paul at the temple, and they stirred up the whole crowd and seized him, accusing him of bringing Gentiles into the temple. They said this because they had previously seen Trophimus the Ephesian in the city with Paul, and assumed that Paul had brought him into the temple. While they were trying to kill him, news reached the commander of the Roman troops that the whole city of Jerusalem was in an uproar. When the rioters saw the commander and his soldiers, they stopped beating Paul. The commander came up and arrested him and asked who he was and what he had done. Some in the crowd shouted one thing and some another, and since the commander could not get at the truth because of the uproar, he ordered that Paul be taken into the barracks. When Paul reached the steps, the violence of the mob was so great that he had to be carried by the soldiers. As the soldiers were about to take Paul into the barracks, he started asking questions to the commander, and the commander was surprised that Paul could speak Greek. He had assumed that Paul must have been the troublemaker Egyptian guy he'd heard about that had led 4,000 terrorists out into the desert. Paul tells him he is a Roman Jew from Tarsus, and he gets permission to speak to the crowd once they settle down. When they heard him speak to them in Aramaic, they became very quiet. Paul tells the Jews that he himself is a Jew who studied under the great teacher Gamaliel, and that he used to persecute the people of the way. He then goes on to tell them that while he was on his way to Damascus to arrest the followers of Jesus, Jesus himself appeared to him with a blinding light on the road, saying, "Saul, why are you persecuting me?" He tells them how he had been blind, but had been healed, and how he had been baptized as a believer in Jesus. He then tells the crowd how he had been given a message from God while in a trance at the temple, telling him to leave Jerusalem because the people there would not believe his message. And when he says that God had told him to go and deliver his message to the Gentiles, the crowd went into an uproar once again, shouting, "Rid the earth of him! He's not fit to live!" The Roman commander ordered that Paul be taken into the barracks. He directed that he be tortured and interrogated in order to find out why the people were shouting at him like this. But when Paul mentions that he's not only a Jew from Tarsus, but also a high-ranking Roman citizen, the commander gets scared and tells the interrogators to get away from him. The commander wanted to find out exactly why Paul was being accused by the Jews, so the next day he released him and ordered the chief priests and all the members of the Sanhedrin to assemble. Then he brought Paul and had him stand before them. Paul tells the Sanhedrin that he has fulfilled his duty to God. At this, the high priest Ananias ordered those standing near Paul to strike him on the mouth. Then Paul said to him, "God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. You sit there to judge me according to the law, yet you yourself violate the law by commanding that I be struck." Those who were standing near Paul said, "How dare you insult God's high priest?" Paul replied, "Brothers, I did not realize that he was the high priest, for it is written, 'Do not speak evil about the ruler of your people.'" Then Paul, knowing that some of them were Sadducees and the others Pharisees, decided to change the subject and play the parties against each other, and he called out in the Sanhedrin, "My brothers, I am a Pharisee, descended from Pharisees. I stand on trial because of the hope of the resurrection of the dead." When he said this, a dispute broke out between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. You see, the Sadducees say that there is no resurrection, and that there are neither angels nor spirits, but the Pharisees believe all these things. The dispute became so violent that the commander was afraid Paul would be torn to pieces by them. He ordered the troops to go down and take him away from them by force and bring him into the barracks. The following night the Lord stood near Paul and said, "Take courage. As you have testified about me in Jerusalem, so you must also testify in Rome." The next morning, more than 40 Jews formed a conspiracy and plotted with the Sanhedrin to get the commander to have Paul brought in for more questioning, so that they could intercept him and kill him on the way. But when Paul's nephew heard of this plot, he went into the barracks and told Paul. Then Paul had a centurion take his nephew to the commander to tell him what he had overheard. The commander listened to the boy and warned him not to tell anyone about the report he had brought. The commander then calls together 470 soldiers and prepares to have them transfer Paul over to Caesarea that night to be kept under the care of Governor Felix. And he wrote a letter to be delivered to the governor, explaining why Paul was being delivered to him, with a few extra lines making himself look like a hero for saving Paul from those crazy Jews. and Paul and the letter were delivered, but Governor Felix told Paul that he would wait to hear his testimony until his accusers arrived, and he ordered that Paul be kept under guard in Herod's palace. 5 days later, the high priest Ananias went down to Caesarea with some of the elders and a lawyer named Tertullus, and they brought their charges against Paul before the governor. After flattering the governor for a while, they state that Paul is a ringleader of the Nazarene sect who tried to desecrate the temple, and that they tried to seize him, but the Roman commander Lysias violently interfered. Felix then lets Paul defend himself, and Paul proclaims his innocence, and he does admit to the governor that he did intentionally place some already angry Pharisees and Sadducees against each other by shouting about the resurrection. Then Felix, who was well acquainted with the way, adjourned the proceedings, saying that he would decide the case after Commander Lysias arrived. He ordered the centurion to keep Paul under guard, but to give him freedom and permit his friends to take care of his needs. Several days later, Felix came with his wife Drusilla, who was Jewish. He sent for Paul and listened to him as he spoke about faith in Christ Jesus. As Paul talked about righteousness, self-control, and the judgment to come, Felix was afraid and said, "Oh, that's enough for now." At the same time, he was hoping that Paul would offer him a bribe, so he sent for him frequently and talked with him. When 2 years had passed, Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus, but because Felix wanted to grant a favor to the Jews, he left Paul in prison.